Many people visiting Oak Springs Estates for the first time thought they had stepped into a feature from a real estate magazine. Tree-lined streets curved past pastel-hued houses, each with a small, precisely manicured lawn. The local developer had built the estate 15 years ago, promising a tranquil suburban haven for both middle-class families and retired couples alike. At first glance, Oak Springs Estates lived up to that promise. Hedges trimmed to matching heights, sidewalks edged to crisp perfection, and matching mailboxes that lent the community a clean, uniform flair. Children rode bicycles in the cul-de-sacs, and older residents took morning walks with dogs in tow. On many evenings, neighbors gathered for informal barbecues or chatted across white picket fences, giving the impression of a close-knit, harmonious suburb. Yet beneath this idyllic surface lay the typical tensions found in any community governed by a homeowners association, HOA. The HOA board regulated everything from allowed front door colors to permissible lawn ornaments. It had the power to issue fines, send stern warning letters, and summon homeowners to compliance hearings for seemingly minor infractions. While many saw the benefit of maintaining high property standards, others felt increasingly suffocated by the ever-growing list of rules, especially after HOA Karen Farnsworth joined the board and made it her personal mission to police everyone else's behavior with militant zeal. Still, life in Oak Springs functioned relatively smoothly, with neighbors generally getting along. They greeted passers-by, waved to kids on skateboards, and exchanged recipe tips at the clubhouse. But that was all about to change, thanks to a small, unassuming alley behind a row of houses. Before long, the alley would become the stage for an astonishing showdown, one that would pit the entire neighborhood, and eventually the city, against a single, obstinate HOA official determined to fence everyone out. Marjorie Farnsworth was in her late 40s, with a perfectly shaped blonde bob that never seemed out of place, even on windy days. She dressed in starched blazers, pressed slacks, and sensible low heels, carrying herself with the crisp authority of someone who believed she was always right. She had joined Oak Springs Estates only 3 years prior, ostensibly drawn by the quiet environment, but she wasted no time inserting herself into every aspect of the HOA. Residents soon learned that Karen was the whispered nickname they used for her, an apt moniker for someone so prone to self-righteous lectures and stiffly worded complaints. Karen Farnsworth memorized the entire HOA bylaws binder, quoting obscure sections to justify her vigilance over lawns, fences, and Christmas lights. She caught wind of every minor violation, real or imagined, and had a knack for stirring up drama even when no one else saw cause for concern. She once threatened a neighbor with fines for leaving a recycling bin visible from the street, demanded that another remove a plastic flamingo ornament from a flower bed, and scolded anyone who dared hang decorative wind chimes that made excessive noise. Most neighbors, out of weariness, complied with her petty orders, hoping to avoid more trouble. Karen's presence hung like a storm cloud over the otherwise peaceful Oak Springs. Although she took immense pride in controlling the look and feel of the community, she remained oblivious to how unpopular she had become. She believed every complaint, every citation, and every sneer was merely the cost of doing the right thing. Her fixation on uniformity and safety would soon shift to the alley behind Magnolia Street, setting the stage for her most brazen overreach yet. The unassuming alley behind Magnolia Street was about 12 feet wide, connecting the neighborhood's back fences to a small park on the far side. It wasn't particularly scenic, cracked pavement, the occasional pothole, and some spots of graffiti, but it offered a crucial shortcut. Young parents pushing strollers used it to avoid busy roads. Wheelchair users found the gentle slope preferable to hilly sidewalks, and local kids loved zipping through on scooters or skateboards to reach the park's basketball court. Technically, the alley belonged to the city, not the HOA. Municipal crews maintained it, albeit infrequently, and the HOA had little say over how it was used. Most residents treated the alley as part of daily life. Some houses had back gates opening onto it. Others had small side paths connecting to it. Anyone who lived in that row of homes felt grateful for the quick route to the park or bus stop. In short, the alley was an overlooked gem of convenience. Nobody could recall when it was first paved, some said decades ago, but it served as an unspoken lifeline for seniors, parents with strollers, and children. Even families from a neighboring district would sometimes cut through to reach the park. No one had ever objected. The presence of a narrow, friendly thoroughfare had caused little friction until Karen Farnsworth started to notice it more closely. Karen's initial interest in the alley was sparked by random observations of teenagers skating there. She peered from a distance, perceiving their harmless hangouts as potential loitering. Curiosity led her to examine the city's property maps, discovering that yes, the alley was municipal land but abutted the private backyards of Magnolia Street. That combination of public and private unsettled her, especially since she couldn't impose typical HOA rules on it. Her irritation grew when she overheard Lucille Porter, an elderly resident who used a motorized wheelchair, praising the alley. Lucille told a friend it was the easiest path to the nearby bus stop. Karen frowned, feeling a twinge of resentment that the alley, unregulated by the HOA, had become so essential to some folks. Her sense of control was threatened. Next, Karen learned that families outside Oak Springs occasionally used the alley as well, skipping the main road to visit the park. That discovery really set her off. She despised the notion of outsiders breezing through her carefully monitored domain. The more she pondered it, the more she convinced herself that the alley was a breeding ground for litter, petty crime, and property value erosion. No specific incidents or police reports backed up her concerns, but Karen didn't care. She began taking notes, snapping pictures of the graffiti, and rummaging through the HOA bylaws in search of a loophole that would let her restrict alley usage. If the city wasn't going to regulate it, perhaps she could. A single phrase kept echoing in her mind: for the safety of our community. Fueled by that conviction, she prepared a plan that would shock the entire neighborhood. Even before Karen took action, rumors began trickling through Oak Springs. A few residents had spotted her walking the alley in the early mornings, measuring distances with a tape measure and photographing the backs of people's fences. Others reported her muttering about making this place safer. Whispers circulated. What is Karen up to this time? Speculation ranged from she's going to demand higher backyard fences to she'll force the city to block it off. A handful of neighbors shrugged it off, thinking she had no real authority on city property. But those who knew Karen's resourcefulness felt uneasy. She had a reputation for bending rules, and sometimes forging new ones, to get her way. Lucille Porter grew anxious. She relied on the alley for daily errands. Jim and Heather Carlisle, who pushed a stroller along the alley to avoid traffic, worried that any restriction might complicate their routine. And Jacob Wills, a local teenager, sounded the alarm after seeing Karen with a clipboard near a sign that read, "No dumping." "She's definitely planning something," he told his parents. She kept muttering about how we can't let kids roam free anymore. Still, no one imagined Karen would attempt something so blatantly illegal as constructing a barrier across public land. Oak Springs was a quiet suburb where that sort of audacity simply didn't happen. But as the old saying goes, there's a first time for everything. One Saturday night, around 10 p.m., a small pickup truck rolled into the entrance of the alley. A few residents, still awake, gazing out their windows, noticed headlights shining in an unusual direction. To their astonishment, they saw Marjorie Farnsworth emerge from the truck, accompanied by a burly, unfamiliar man. Under the dim glow of a distant street lamp, they began unloading lumber, metal posts, and a tool kit. The faint hum of power tools soon filled the air. A few neighbors, too startled or timid to intervene, merely watched from behind curtains. They could see Karen directing the handyman, pointing at spots on the ground. Clanging noises and the occasional burst of drilling echoed in the night. Some considered calling the police, but hesitated, unsure if Karen had official approval. After all, she often mentioned her ties to the HOA and city planning. Nobody wanted to risk legal trouble by confronting her. By midnight, under the cover of darkness, an entire wooden fence spanned the alley, anchored by metal posts on each side. A cheap padlock and chain secured a makeshift wooden gate in the center. The sign Karen hung read, "Private access. No trespassing. Authorized by Oak Springs Estates HOA." For any onlooker, the message was baffling. The alley was public land. The city had never transferred ownership. Yet Karen seemed determined to claim the space on behalf of the HOA. Her hope was that once the fence was up, it would be far harder to remove. And if anyone questioned her, she'd wave around some trumped-up safety concerns as justification. Sunday morning dawned bright and mild, ideal for strolling to the park. Parents with children in strollers set out, only to discover an impenetrable fence blocking the alley. They stood there, jaws dropping at the padlocked gate. On the fence, a notice in large letters demanded authorization from the HOA, a phrase that made no sense, given the land was municipal. Those first arrivals ran home to alert others. Soon, a small crowd gathered, staring in disbelief at the structure. Lucille Porter, navigating her motorized wheelchair, found herself forced to take a much longer detour around the block, crossing a steep street with no proper curb cuts. She was visibly upset. The alley had been her easiest route for years. Jim and Heather Carlisle complained that they now had to push their stroller down a busy street. Their toddler was cranky, they were late for an appointment, and the unnecessary inconvenience infuriated them. Several kids on scooters stood there, perplexed and disappointed. And all around them, neighbors whispered angrily, "She can't do this. It's city property. We've never had an issue with outsiders. Why this fence? I saw them working at midnight. This is insane." By noon, people had tried knocking on Karen's door to demand an explanation. She did not answer. Her phone went to voicemail. Meanwhile, the sign she posted offered no clues beyond threatening trespass citations. Oak Springs Estates, once known for easygoing neighbors, found itself in a collective rage, courtesy of the self-styled Karen and her unauthorized fence. Outraged by the sudden closure of a beloved walkway, residents leapt into action. Online, they used Nextdoor and community Facebook pages to share photos of the fence. The story spread rapidly. Families complaining about longer, hazardous routes, senior citizens unable to access the bus stop, children losing a safe path to the park. Carmen Mendoza, a mother of two, started a Change.org petition titled, "Remove the Unauthorized Alley Fence at Oak Springs." More than 200 residents, over half the households, signed within a day. Others wrote directly to City Hall, asking if this structure had been permitted. Officials initially expressed confusion. They had no record of any alley fence project in Oak Springs. One city representative promised an inspection. Meanwhile, some residents considered more direct methods. Cut the padlock in the dead of night. Saw through the wood. Push it down in protest. But cooler heads worried about legal repercussions and decided to wait for the city to respond. Even so, frustration bubbled close to the surface. Lucille Porter discussed staging a wheelchair rally at the fence, highlighting how it discriminated against people with disabilities. Others were ready to picket in front of Karen's home. But Karen, for her part, remained elusive. She slipped out of her garage early and returned at odd hours. When neighbors tried to stop her in the street, she'd roll up her window and drive off. If confronted in her driveway, she'd spout the same line. "I'm acting in the best interest of our community's safety. Take it up with the HOA." The tension mounting in Oak Springs Estates was palpable, and all eyes turned to the scheduled HOA meeting in hopes of a solution. The regularly scheduled HOA meeting was weeks away, but the uproar forced Richard Klein, the board's president, to call an emergency session on Thursday evening at the Oak Springs Clubhouse. Invitations went out by email and paper flyers. Anger and anticipation ran high. That Thursday, the small clubhouse overflowed with residents eager to speak. Folding chairs formed rows before a long table where the 5 HOA board members typically sat. Karen was among them, wearing a pressed beige suit and a tight smile, a folder labeled Alley Enforcement clutched in her hands. Richard Klein opened the session. "Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're here primarily to address the newly built fence across the municipal alley." His statement was drowned by grumbles of frustration from the crowd. When order was restored, Richard continued, "We've received numerous complaints. Marjorie, would you like to explain the reasoning behind this structure?" Karen rose, shoulders back. "Certainly. The alley has become a hotspot for trespassing, litter, potential vandalism, and it compromises our property values. The city has shown no real oversight. As an HOA official, I took steps to protect the community. This fence is essential for safety." A chorus of objections erupted. Carmen Mendoza waved printouts of city property maps. "The alley isn't ours to fence off. This is public land." Jim Carlisle jumped up to add, "You're making life harder for families, seniors, everyone." The resulting din required Richard to bang his gavel repeatedly. When the ruckus settled, Karen persisted. "We have to consider future liabilities. If someone gets hurt in that alley, we could face lawsuits. I'm protecting us all." Her words rang hollow. Richard exchanged exasperated looks with the other board members. They had no record of approving this construction. It seemed Karen had bypassed the usual process. By meeting's end, Richard demanded the fence be removed immediately. Karen refused, claiming the city would need to intervene. Residents left the clubhouse furious yet resolved. If Karen wasn't willing to back down, they would take their fight to a higher authority. Over the following week, Oak Springs City Hall was bombarded with calls, emails, and petitions from residents demanding action. The city dispatched 2 inspectors to examine the fence, wearing neon vests and carrying clipboards. They measured the barrier's placement, snapped photos of how it was anchored into the alley pavement, and listened to residents' complaints. Those inspectors were clear. No permit had ever been granted for such a fence on city land. That afternoon, a bright orange notice of violation was posted on the fence. "Attention! This structure violates municipal code. Owner must remove it within 5 business days or face legal and financial penalties." Hope surged among residents, who snapped pictures and shared them online. Yet Karen doubled down. She taped her own sign next to the city notice. "Fence is a protective barrier erected by the Oak Springs HOA. Unauthorized removal will result in civil action." This contradictory signage confused some and outraged others. Neighbors debated tearing the fence down themselves, but they feared legal reprisals. Karen was known to threaten lawsuits at the slightest provocation, so they pinned their hopes on the city's enforcement power. Meanwhile, Karen filed a formal appeal, claiming public safety necessitated the barrier. The city scheduled a hearing for the following week. Oak Springs had never witnessed such a blatant standoff. Families, seniors, and city officials all waited anxiously to see if the system would hold Karen accountable, or if she'd somehow manipulate the process yet again. Karen's appeal document, submitted to the city, was a tangled mess of unsubstantiated claims. She insisted local teenagers turned the alley into graffiti central, cited rumored vandalism, and hinted that wheelchair users themselves were at risk if they navigated an allegedly dangerous slope. She argued that the HOA's liability was too great to leave the alley open. The city reviewed her statements, noting the lack of concrete evidence: no police reports, no documented injuries, no formal complaints. Meanwhile, the neighborhood banded together, gathering affidavits from families emphasizing how safe and convenient the alley had always been. Lucille Porter underscored her daily reliance on it for mobility, explaining how the fence forced her to traverse busier roads with no curb ramps. Despite overwhelming opposition, Karen found a tiny faction of allies, maybe 10 residents, who believed she was right to block outsiders. They shared anecdotes of strangers walking behind their homes and nodded gravely about crime potential. Though small, this minority gave Karen a semblance of legitimacy in her appeal. Still, for most in Oak Springs, the fence was a colossal mistake. The city hearing approached, and the local newspaper ran a brief article on the dispute, calling it a suburban battle over a public alley and accessibility rights. As the tension ratcheted up, many braced for the possibility that Karen's stubbornness might drag the situation into costly legal battles. On the morning of the city hearing, a group of neighbors staged a peaceful protest in front of the fence. Children with scooters and bikes gathered, along with parents pushing strollers, seniors in wheelchairs, and everyday pedestrians. Some held signs reading "Free Our Alley" or "Wheelchair Access is a Right." Karen arrived with 2 of her supporters, presumably to document any vandalism. She wore a navy blue blazer, filming the crowd on her smartphone. When a father spoke up about how the fence disrupted his morning commute with his toddler, Karen responded with her usual briskness: "I'm saving your family from potential hazards. One day you'll thank me." Lucille Porter, riled by the blockade, maneuvered her wheelchair closer. "How dare you? I've lived here 20 years without any so-called hazard, until you installed that fence." Karen stiffened. "Ms. Porter, you're ignoring real liabilities. The alley is an accident waiting to happen. I'm preventing future tragedy." The heated exchange was recorded by multiple bystanders, some live streaming to social media. Online viewers erupted in condemnation, labeling Karen a tyrant or busybody. She eventually marched off, presumably heading to City Hall to plead her case. Meanwhile, the protesters remained, hoping their show of unity would underscore how crucial the alley was to daily life. Later that afternoon, the municipal hearing convened at City Hall. A judge presided, flanked by a city attorney, an HOA representative, distinct from Karen, and a volunteer attorney from a disability rights group who'd taken an interest in Lucille Porter's situation. Karen arrived with her binder of evidence, repeating claims of trespassing and graffiti. It took little time for the city to refute her arguments with official surveys, police records, or lack thereof, and statements from affected residents. When asked for proof of any real hazard, Karen could offer only vague hearsay. The judge appeared unimpressed. After a brief deliberation, the ruling was swift and decisive. The fence was illegal and must be removed within 72 hours. If it remained, the city would demolish it and bill the responsible party, namely, Karen, covering labor and associated fines. Moreover, the judge hinted that any person with restricted mobility who was harmed by the fence's presence might have grounds for a civil suit against Karen personally, since the HOA had never authorized this structure. Word of the court's decision spread instantly through Oak Springs. Text messages and social media lit up with celebratory posts. Many residents felt relieved. Their trust in civic order was vindicated. Karen, on the other hand, looked pale and furious as she exited City Hall. This was the first time her tactics had truly backfired, and it wouldn't end with just a court order. That same evening, a city official delivered a formal demolition notice to Karen's home. She refused to answer the door, but the official pinned the warning to her fence. She had 72 hours to comply, or crews would tear it down. At an emergency HOA meeting the next day, tensions flared. Board President Richard Klein was livid. "Marjorie, you acted without the board's approval. Now we're facing a fiasco," he said. The HOA's legal counsel insisted the association disavow her actions to avoid liability. Karen tried to blame the board for ignoring safety, but no one listened. Her formerly intimidating presence had evaporated. She stood alone, corners of her mouth tight with anger. Faced with personal financial penalties, Karen reluctantly agreed to dismantle the fence rather than wait for city workers. The fine she owed soared into the thousands of dollars. Neighbors who had once cowered before her now regarded her with open contempt or cold indifference. She had overplayed her hand, and Oak Springs was through tolerating her tyranny. When demolition day arrived, a throng of residents gathered in the alley, sipping coffee and chatting as Karen's hired contractor took down the fence. The wood boards and metal posts came out in under 2 hours. Children on scooters immediately zipped through, whooping in delight. A few folks cheered. Lucille Porter, watching from her wheelchair, grinned broadly as she tested the newly opened passage. But the tale didn't stop there. The city had witnessed how crucial the alley was for Oak Springs and decided to expedite a modest improvement project. Within weeks, work crews paved over the old cracked concrete with smooth asphalt, filled in potholes, and even installed a solar-powered light for safety after dark. They also built small curb ramps at either end, accommodating wheelchairs and strollers more easily. Suddenly, the once-forgotten alley was in the best condition of its existence. Families strolled more frequently. Seniors cruised by in wheelchairs with minimal bumps. Kids still used it as a safe route to the park. The entire fiasco, ironically, had upgraded the alley beyond anyone's earlier expectations. In a sense, Karen's meddling led to a bright silver lining. In the wake of the fence controversy, Marjorie Karen Farnsworth found her clout on the HOA board severely diminished. She narrowly avoided an outright expulsion, but residents openly dismissed her opinions, remembering how she nearly cost them a vital walkway. The stigma of that fence fiasco trailed her through the neighborhood. No one took her threats seriously anymore. Meanwhile, Oak Springs Estates experienced a renewed sense of neighborly unity. The board vowed to engage more community feedback before any major action, and residents felt empowered to speak up rather than fear citations. The freshly paved alley became a local point of pride. Families sometimes jokingly called it Karen's Alley, a tongue-in-cheek reminder of how far the neighborhood had come. Lucille Porter emerged as a quiet hero for raising awareness about mobility. Many recognized that her willingness to speak out had shone a bright light on the fence's harm, strengthening the case to remove it. At one HOA gathering, a few even suggested naming the path Porter's Way, although Lucille, modest as ever, waved off the idea. "It belongs to all of us now, and that's how it should be," she said. Over time, the story of the alley fence became a cautionary tale told to new residents. Yes, we had a Karen who tried to block a public alley, but the city shut her down, and the neighborhood rallied for what was right. The moral was simple yet profound. When a community unites against an overstep, they can transform conflict into positive, lasting change. In the end, Karen's misguided crusade had an unintended consequence. The alley that once was cracked and overlooked now stood as a shining example of accessibility and neighborly collaboration. Families laughed, children played, seniors cruised smoothly, proving that sometimes the best answer to a Karen is an entire neighborhood standing together to uphold the common good.